All right, everyone. Welcome to the next lecture, Chapter 8, which is titled Getting Off to a Fast Start with jQuery. As always, I like to talk about what's the importance of this topic. Several of you will probably remember jQuery. When we studied Bootstrap, you know that jQuery was something that Bootstrap used. And although we might not have understood it or actually wrote any jQuery, we know that the edition of Bootstrap that we were using used jQuery. So we know that it's used out there, at least in that sense. What jQuery is, the easiest way to think of jQuery is a bunch of pre-written JavaScript functions. And so basically some people got together and said, you know what, this JavaScript, it's challenging, yes. And to accomplish a task, you might have to write quite a bit of code sometimes. And so they wanted to simplify the tasks, that what you can do in JavaScript. They wanted to make an easier way to do it. And so they wrote jQuery. And the idea, at least the theory, is that everything that you can do in JavaScript, you can do in jQuery. And at one point that was true. That doesn't really completely hold completely true anymore. But a lot of the tasks, so we'll say a lot of the tasks that you can do in JavaScript, you can do in jQuery, except for you can do it with less code and it will perform better is the goal. So if you think of the jQuery slogan is write less code, and do more. And so that's kind of the objective behind jQuery. Now, I will say, if you have struggled with JavaScript, and I know at least a handful of students have, then this is an opportunity to get back up to speed. Because if you felt like you were sinking, if you were underwater, jQuery is your life vest. jQuery is going to bring your head up above water. At least you'll have the opportunity to do that and get your head above water for the rest of the semester. Okay, so there's a little bit of hope if you've been struggling. So we got our normal objectives. The site for jQuery is simply jquery.com. On jquery.com, you have an option to download jQuery locally. Or if you scroll down, you can use jQuery with the CDN. When we were using Bootstrap, we were using jQuery with the CDN. Really, the fastest way to get started, like with Bootstrap, and even still with jQuery, is to use a CDN. You just, again, so what I did was on jquery.com, I clicked on download, but instead of actually downloading one of these links, you just scroll down and you see, CDNs offer a performance benefit. And they download it, a copy of and they don't have to download it multiple times. And the jQuery CDN supports what's called this integrity, sub-resource integrity, which makes sure that the jQuery library has not been tampered with or modified by malicious hackers or something along those lines. right? And they give you a link right here, code.jquery.com. And if we look at the Jquery editions, 3, 2, and 1, we'll kind of cover these different editions. Each edition, or each version, I would say, of Jquery has an uncompressed, and there is your CDN. Okay, so there's a couple clicks to get here. Okay, again, I'll just go through this. I click on download. I scroll down to CDN, and they give you this URL, code.jquery.com. And then I click on whatever. You'll notice, we'll talk about these numbers, what these mean. I think we've talked about them before. There's the uncompressed versus the minified versus the slim and the slim minified. So let's talk about this. Uncompressed, like if I actually navigate to this URL, see this URL right here? I'm going to copy just that URL and I'm going to paste it. And you'll notice that you can actually inspect the JavaScript. This is what Jquery is. See all this JavaScript. It's uncompressed, meaning there's white spaces, and it's essentially something that you could read. If you really want to go behind the scenes and understand what is going on, behind the Jquery library, which is what we're going to, behind Jquery, you have just a bunch of JavaScript. And so you can see a bunch of if-elses and for loops and, a bunch of variables. Look, they use var, they don't use let, tisk. Okay, so you can kind of come in here, and if you really want to be a go-getter, if you really want to understand Jquery, like probably more than you technically need to, you could look at the uncompressed edition of Jquery. Well, of course, the minified then, if I just open up the minified edition of Jquery, you're going to see, of course, they get rid of all the white space. Okay, so the advantage of the minified is it's technically a smaller file, right? Every time someone comes to your web page, they have to download this file or they download the minified file. Well, this file has a bunch of white space, therefore its file size is larger, right? This is a smaller file size than this file. So for production purposes, it makes sense to go ahead and use the minified. I mean, realistically, no one looks at this code anyways. I mean, unless you're a developer and you're trying to understand the under the hood, right? So if we were car people, right, and we want to understand how the engine works, we got to get under the hood. This allows us to look under the hood of Jquery. Okay. But this is not really a good way to look under the hood because you don't understand what's going on. However, it's better for production. So if I'm making a production site, I'm choosing this minified. Okay. Now, both uncompressed and minified, these are full featured, meaning every feature of Jquery is available. Okay. However, there are, because it's fully featured, okay, there might be a lot of features that you don't need. Okay, and so for that reason, because they found out, through years of Jquery, I got to look at the history of when Jquery was first made. I'm guessing 2010. Let's look up Jquery Wiki. I really don't remember. As of May 2019, Jquery is used by 73% of the 10 million most popular websites. How about that for a selling point? Initial release in 2006, 14 years ago. Some of you were young children, young boys and girls. Okay, the Slim just has less features. Okay, so for the purpose of this class, don't mess with the Slim or the Slim minified, right? The difference between Slim and Slim minified is the same difference between uncompressed and minified. Okay, that's just not fully featured. Since you don't have all the features, don't mess with it. Just do right? So if I'm just choosing one every time for class, I'm just going to go ahead and choose uncompressed, right? This is going to be what you use, okay? And if I index.htm, and I'll go ahead and throw in my tab there, and I'm going to put this link to jQuery at the bottom of my HTML. Okay, and we've talked about the advantages as to why this is a slightly preferable place for jQuery. So if we put this is a jQuery Cdn. Okay, but really going back to the slides, jQuery.com is your BFF, right? For the next, for the next 5-6 chapters, whenever we're studying jQuery, this website, jQuery.com, is your best friend. And go ahead and throw this on your favorites bar. We will be referencing this website quite a bit. Okay. Specifically, once you've downloaded it, you got to reference the documentation. Okay. So pretty much everything you need to learn about jQuery is all in here. It's all in this documentation. A lot of what we do when we're learning jQuery comes right from this documentation. And so a lot of the things that we're going to practice, the labs, the tests, etc., comes from what we've learned out of this documentation. So what jQuery offers, let's talk about the selectors. When we think about JavaScript selectors, okay, you actually select things differently with jQuery. Okay, jQuery is still written in a script tag. Okay, it's important to note that if you're going to write jQuery, it's still written inside of a script tag, just like JavaScript. But sequentially, you have to link to jQuery first, and then you can write jQuery. Like you can write your jQuery here on line 17, or you can write JavaScript. And so, as we know, in JavaScript, to select that ID, we said document get element by ID, and we'd say top heading, and we might say inner HTML equals hi mom, right? And so this is how we select things in jQuery, and you could actually see that, you saw that actually change very quickly. Okay, so our selector, the point of this is we've called get element by ID. This is our JavaScript selector. Okay, well, jQuery uses CSS selectors, which is great. It's great because all of you learned CSS selectors as early as the second week of this class, right? So to select now, this is kind of boilerplate jQuery right here. Okay, so lines 21, we'll explain what this is. Okay, now to select that same H1 in jQuery, we're just going to put in we're going to select this just like we would in CSS. Now we've got this $ thing here in front of it and these parentheses. Okay, dollar signs are everywhere in jQuery. Like you'll notice just here, I got this $sign, I got this $sign, right? But inside here, we've got top heading. And you can see it did the same thing. Okay? Now, once you get past this little boilerplate, what is this, right? I think most people would agree that line 22 is a simpler syntax than what I did before, right? Line 22, if I just copy this, I'm going to undo, bring it all back to what I had before. Okay, so this was the JavaScript way, and this is the JavaScript way, jQuery way. Okay, so if I'm just looking at line 21 compared to line 17, okay, and that's not an extreme example of how jQuery is easier, but it begins to give you the idea that we're going to be writing less code. Okay, once you again, you got to get past the boilerplate. So jQuery uses CSS selectors. That's a big benefit. All of the selectors we learned in CSS, the relational selectors, right? The child selectors, the sibling selectors, the adjacent selectors, you know, your star symbol, all of that. Okay. Another thing that jQuery does is it makes it so that you don't have to write cross-browser JavaScript. We started to see that. In order to get compliant JavaScript, we had to write the JavaScript in different ways, okay? Because older browsers weren't DOM compliant, right? And so, point being is that jQuery handles the cross-browser compatibility for us. All of that extra JavaScript that we had to write to get cross-browser compatibility is handled by the jQuery library. So that second bullet, that cross-browser compatibility, you know, in school we don't do a ton of cross-browser work, but in the real world, that is something that's very real and you spend a lot of time with. Okay, so jQuery kind of handles that for us, which is great. And again, of course, this is kind of like the selling point. So they're going to say a compressed library that loads quickly so it doesn't degrade performance. So it's fast, and they're always working on making it faster. Okay, so if you look at the FAQs application, we had a lab where you did this. You wrote JavaScript, and you know you had some HTML, a little bit of HTML, standard stuff. You had some standard CSS. Okay, and take a look at slide 9. If you think about the JavaScript that you had to write as compared to slide 9, obviously slide 9 is probably more condensed and you know it's shorter. The whole idea about jQuery is write less, do more. Now you'll notice if you can see my mouse where I'm hovering, right? This is a selector. We're selecting all the H2s under the ID of FAQs. So this is simply using CSS selectors. Okay? And when you click an H2, you pass an event object, which we've kind of seen before. We assign the H2 equal to the target, which is essentially the actual thing that was clicked, the H2 that was clicked. We then toggle the class. So toggle class is interesting. Toggle class will put a CSS class on an element if it's not there. If it is there, though, it will remove it. So it does what it kind of sounds like it would do, toggles the class. If it's there, it removes it. If it's not there, it adds it. Okay, so toggle class is a function. Has class is a function, and it'll return true or false. It then takes the H2, goes to the next element, and hides it. Otherwise, if it doesn't have a class of minus, it shows the H2, the next element of the H2. So again, much simpler. Okay, what we're going to do as part of this lecture is dive down into some of these different functions, and really, we haven't written anything yet, so I think slide 9 might be a little bit overwhelming, but we're going to kind of step into it step by step. Okay, so don't let slide 9 intimidate you. All right, I already showed you how to download jQuery. Again, I do recommend the CDN. And I showed you where to get the CDN. Okay, so here goes like a little history of the versions of jQuery. You can see like so you start with version 1, version 2, and now we're on version 3. And again, this is still version 3.5. 3.5.1 is what is today as of November 19th, 2020. You probably wake up tomorrow morning and they change this seemingly pretty frequently, right? They go through these versions. So what these numbers mean, the 3 is like a major edition update. And so a lot of times what they do between these different editions, I'll give you an example, like version 1 versus version 2. Version 2 stopped supporting support for IE6 through IE8. Okay, so that was the big deal in 2013, that basically if you were still using IE6 through IE8, you could not use edition 2 of jQuery. Then version 3, 2016, is when they started working on actually condensing, so a smaller source code, as well as making it perform faster. And it also added a slim version. It says, but with some breaking changes. So what that means is if you wrote version 2 and just tried to update it to version 3, odds are some of the things in version 2 wouldn't work in version 3. Right? So it wasn't like backwards compatible is what it gets to. And as you can see, it also added a slim version, which we talked about the slim version being a smaller source code with less features. Okay, and then you can see 3.1.1 was of September of 2016, but of course we've got updates since then. So that's the major additions, is the first number. The second addition is once you have like version 3, 3.1 has a certain feature set. 3.2 has more features than 3.1. 3.3 has even more features, okay? And they are backwards compatible, okay? So, if you are working with 3.5 like we are today, the code from 3.1 will still work. Okay, so really what you're looking at with that second dot is that second dot means a feature set, and they just add more features. The higher the number goes, the more features it has. Okay, the third dot is bug fixes. So if they say, okay, 3.1, they found some bugs in 3.11. So when they fix those bugs, then they call it 3.1.2. Okay, so they fix bugs with that third release, and sometimes it's also performance. So major addition changes 1 to 2, 2 to 3. 2 doesn't support the old browsers. 3 is smaller and faster, but not backwards compatible with 2, and it adds a slim version. And then after that, you got the feature releases, and then you got the bug fixes and the speed enhancements. if you come across a scenario like, oh, I'm I have a jQuery version 2, okay, which we know 3 is not backwards compatible with 2. There are ways to migrate 2 to 3, and that's with what's called a plugin. And so what you do is you would link to jQuery uh, version 3. You link to jQuery version 3 first, and then you would link to this migrate plugin. And this migrate plugin would add some features that were in version 2. Okay, so there is a way to migrate from older editions like version 2 to version 3 without breaking everything, using what's called a plugin. Again, what you would do if you came across this is you would link to jQuery version 3.5.1, whatever the latest version is today, and then you would link to this migrate plugin, which would add in some features that were dropped by version 3. And kind of the same thing there with even older editions. I mean, odds of you actually needing that old migrate plugin are pretty small, but you know, they do exist. The way that I had you link jQuery has this integrity. This is called a SHA-256 hash. And what this SHA-256 hash does, I always think of like the game Telephone that we used to play when we were kids, like in kindergarten. And the game Telephone, it was the idea that like when the first kid in the class would send a message to their friend that they were sitting next to, they would whisper it in their ear. And then they would whisper it in their next person's ear, they'd whisper it in the next person's ear. But they could only tell it to them once. And by the time it got to the 20th student in the class, the message was completely different than what it originated. Okay, that's what a hash does. It's a computer algorithm that verifies that this file right here, this jQuery file that you're downloading from the internet, is the same file when it is at the end of its journey, being on your computer, as it was when it came from this URL. So this is kind of like the first student, this URL, this place on the internet that you're downloading this file. And then, you know, your computer is the last student in line, and this SHA hash makes sure that the message doesn't change. In other words, that some, you know, bad, malicious, we'll call him a hacker, doesn't intercept this file and then change one of the functions, you know, to do something malicious. Okay, so it's a security thing. And cross-origin anonymous just means that you could do this anonymously on the internet. Like you don't have to be like behind a username and password in order to verify this file with its SHA hash. All right. So I kind of showed you the syntax for a jQuery selector. The way that it's done is with this $sign, and that's why in the JavaScript portion of this textbook, I was like, I don't really like that $sign selector because it conflicts with the jQuery $sign selector. And again, what goes inside these quotes? So it's $, parentheses, open and close quotes. And what goes inside this quote is a CSS selector. And let me, you know, you can combine, you know, what we've learned, like alert is a JavaScript function that we're all familiar with. And so alert comes from window.alert. which is just regular old JavaScript, okay? But I'm going to combine JavaScript with jQuery, so you can definitely do that. I'm going to target the same thing here, and I'm just going to throw it in an alert. I'm going to alert top heading. So let's just see what that does. I'm going to comment out that little line of JavaScript. So this is a jQuery selector that's selecting the top heading and then putting that inside of an alert. The top heading is that. Let's just see what this does. So it actually worked, although it simply says it selected an object. That's not very useful for us. What we might do then is select the top heading, which is, as it said, an object, and we might get the text out of it. And I would expect that to say this is my heading. Let's see, top. It's interesting that that didn't work. Let's just try this in 2 steps instead of 1. I see my mistake. Good morning. Let me bring this back. Let me take it back to what I had it. I didn't need to do this. This is what I had originally that didn't work. What did I not do? Well, how do you select an ID? It's with a pound top heading. There we go. So if I take the text back off, yes, now it still says object. So I do need to append the dot text to read this is my heading. If I could do a dot HTML, that typically brings anything inside of it. So if I had like a span, see, now it includes the span inside of there. And I'm going to pause the recording. Hang tight, guys. We are live. We are back. So let's pick up where we left off. We were just fixing a little bug that I had and kind of demonstrating the difference between the HTML function versus the text function, which the text does not include the HTML as you might have guessed. Okay, that's kind of where we left off. Just looking at a couple different functions, as well as, let me zoom out of this. So, I mean, that's great. Where we're talking about our selectors. We know how to select classes. We know how to select IDs. We know how to select elements. We know how to select descendants. We know how to select. Everything's a lot easier to select in jQuery than it is traditional JavaScript. That's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. So they give some examples of selecting a bunch of paragraphs, a bunch, everything inside of the P. And so let's go ahead and, put in some paragraphs. 1, 2, 3 paragraphs. And let's do an alert of all of our paragraphs, text. And then you get P1, P2, P3. Now, here's another thing about JavaScript. If you think about what we just did, and just this little bit of text, select all the paragraphs and read their text. Probably if you were doing that in jQuery, you would have had to put it inside of an array, put all these paragraphs inside of an array, and then loop through the array to read the text. So what I'm getting at is with jQuery, many cases handle the loops for you. So if you didn't like loops, you're going to love jQuery, because in many cases, notice I didn't say all, but in many cases, you just get the functionality of the loops. Because why? Because the loops are there, they're behind these functions. The loops are behind the, if you were to look up in the uncompressed jQuery file, if you were to look up this text function, you're going to see a loop in there. They coded the loop for you. Okay, so automatic looping is a big benefit of jQuery. Descendant selectors, adjacent selectors, sibling selectors, children, right? I would encourage everyone to revisit 30 CSS selectors you must memorize. Okay? And give yourself a little refresher, or maybe even practice. There was an entire chapter in our HTML book on CSS selectors. And I know we did some labs and some homeworks where you were doing all these kinds of selectors. At least you should have been doing these kinds of selectors. Multiple selectors separated by commas. All that works. It is CSS3 compliant. So if you can select it with CSS3, you can select it with jQuery. Once you have a selection, the next thing you do is you apply a method to it. Now, really, you see here, you got the val function twice, you got the text function twice, the HTML function twice, the next, submit, and focus. These are real simple, okay? Because they all have JavaScript equivalents, right? Val is for text box and select, drop down with the select. Remember, the select tag is a drop down list, text area. Okay, so when you see val without something in the quotes, then it's a read operation. If you say val and something in the quotes, and I'm kind of typing, oh, I guess I should type it in my code editor. That's what the code editor is for. Let me pull up. Did I close? No, I didn't. Okay. So if I do an alert with text here, notice there's nothing inside of the text. But if I were to, this is a read operation. So in other words, text without anything in it is a read operation. And what I'm doing is we're reading it and we're putting it into an alert for the output. Okay. Text with something in it is a write operation. And so let's just take all the paragraphs of text, let's put something in it and say, you know, something silly. And notice it changes all of our paragraphs to say, I'm wondering if my recording is getting at full screen. I don't know. I'm actually worried that I'm resizing my, I hope this doesn't screw things up too bad. I might just be screwing with my recording right now. So either this is going to fix it or it's going to break it. So I don't know. Not for your concern right now. But if you're watching the recorded version of this, this is either going to help or not. I don't know. Okay. So value are for your text boxes. Text are for any HTML elements. HTML is the same thing, but you saw the difference between text and HTML. Next is kind of like first child. Or excuse me, next is more like first sibling. It's the next element in the document. So it goes to a sibling. And then the submit and focus are for your forms. You could submit with the submit method, and you can focus using a focus method. And they kind of show you here of the correct way of using val is by putting it inside of the parentheses, not using an equal sign. And so we're kind of looking here at the val function, at the text function. Literally, I've demonstrated all of these codes. Okay, I mentioned this earlier that Jquery Events. Well, in JavaScript, everything's event driven. Jquery is the same way. The way that we wire up an event in Jquery is we're going to target the element, dot, and then the name of the event, and then we write an anonymous function right here. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start tying in some events. Okay, before I tie in an event, I mentioned that there's some boilerplate things necessary. And what this boilerplate is, you can see this in my code right here. Line 22 and 28. Line 22 and 28 is what's called, let's talk about this. This is the boilerplate template. Okay, so again, what you do is you link to Jquery first. After you link to Jquery, you got your own script tag. Inside of the script tag, you write the document ready function. What the document ready does, the ready function waits for the HTML to download. Okay, it's similar to window on load, but there are some minor differences. Okay, not that we need to be concerned with the minor differences, but here's what those minor differences are. If you are working with, for example, a video, the ready function waits for that video to, and I don't know if it's completely download before the Jquery runs. Same thing with images. It waits for those images to download. So all of the files that are necessary for the page to display it waits for all those to download. Okay, which then means you can interact with all of the elements. Okay, and the window on load doesn't wait for everything. Okay, so window on load doesn't wait for everything, but document ready is more, I would consider it more patient. It waits for all of the necessary files to download so that you can work with them. Okay, so step one is to write document.ready function. And that is written just like this. Okay, notice again what we have in here is an anonymous function. That anonymous function goes from right here. Okay, if I delete the anonymous function, what you're left with is this. But this is what we write it as. Now, let me there is a shortcut. Instead of writing this whole document.ready, you simply can pass it the $sign. And so this can be replaced with this. Notice that still works. Okay, so shorthand for document.ready, again, this and this are the same thing. It says the DOM is ready. That's more technically correct than what I said, which is all the files are downloaded and ready to work with. Once you have the ready function coded, now we can code the event handlers. You'll notice an event handler goes inside of the ready function. So what do we have here? We've got an H1 and we've got some paragraphs. So let's target the H1 top heading dot click. So it's on JavaScript, everything was on click, on hover, on dasher, on dancer, on everything. And then jQuery is simply click. It's simply toggle. It's simply hover. It's not on click, it's just click. Inside of the click then, we write another anonymous function. Boom, boom, curlies, semicolon, alert, top heading was clicked. Let's take a look. Click it, top heading was clicked. Click it, top heading was clicked. All right, so that's, you guys remember nth child selector? So we're going to target the paragraph nth child, p colon nth child 1. Click function, curlies, semicolon. So now if we click the top heading or the first paragraph, let's see if I got an error. Now, what I did was I didn't select it correctly. Colon nth child. Let's see. Nth child 1. By the way, single quotes or double quotes does not matter. Nth child 1, click. And that's nth child. Colon nth hyphen child, and then the number. Paragraph nth child. All right, I'm literally going to copy and paste this. I didn't see anything different. Oh. All that I did was change the 1. I don't have any other paragraphs. So if I say 2, something's fishy. So I mean, it's working the way it's supposed to. It's just confusing me. It's not a problem with the code. It's a problem with my comprehension, because I would think that the second paragraph would be P2, yet I'm clicking P1. And so, granted, what I don't have is any sort of parent other than body here. Body would be the parent of all 3 of these. And so maybe this is the second child. Let's see if I delete that. Okay, that H1 was being counted as a child. And so, anyways, again, it is working the way it's supposed to. It's just counting that H1 as a paragraph, which it shouldn't have. So that's strange. Let's move on. It's not the point of this lecture. The point where I left off is the different event handlers. All we have is the ready function. Now we're coding our handlers and all the things, the mouse over, the mouse out. If you're curious about what events that we can code, well, you're in luck, because when you go to the API documentation and you go down to events, we've got blur events and click events and double clicks and, oh boy, individual page key clicks, you know, the mouse positioning, prevent default, as we've been familiar with. Okay, so those are where you would write your events. These are not really necessarily jQuery selectors. These are CSS selectors. And again, I would encourage you to review those CSS selectors. I've been doing this for a long time. I still don't have them perfect, but with a little bit of practice, you always get them to work, right? These are just selectors. There's a demonstration of using all those selectors. Okay. Let's do something, because I do want to come back to these methods and practice a lot of these. Okay, I'm going to put this in the this lecture is going to be on pause for a little bit. So let me pause this lecture. Okay, folks, so where we left off was on slide 34, and slide 35 gives some examples of the methods on slide 34, but I thought I would do some of the things that we have done in JavaScript, just doing them now in jQuery. We can use jQuery, for example, to write CSS using a CSS method. So if I kind of go back here, and right now we got a click event on a paragraph, and instead of take a step back. Step 1 is to write the document ready. Step 2 was to write the event handlers. Now step 3 is to use jQuery methods. And so that's where we're at. We're looking at all these different methods that can actually modify the HTML. It can modify the CSS. Again, what you can do here is can completely control all your HTML and modify all your HTML and modify all your CSS on various events. And so we can target the very paragraph, target that same paragraph, put that in quotes. So once you click this paragraph, we can write a CSS function, and you'll notice on the slide that when you're writing a CSS, you give it a property name and a value. So this is your CSS property, which is a string, and then a value, which is a string. So this will add the CSS property of the color and the value of red. So you'll notice when I click, it adds, if I inspect now, you can see it actually adds an inline style tag of color red. So it modifies the DOM, if you will. So that's what's here, and we can write HTML. So instead of using the CSS function, we can write the HTML function, and this is a paragraph. And so, you know, imagine, I always use the example of you click on a movie, like imagine Netflix, and you click on the image of a movie and it pops up a little paragraph description. And so, you know, you click on the paragraph in this case, and it's going to add maybe a span. This is a description. And granted, this is going to be replacing the HTML of that paragraph. So right, so it replaces the HTML that's there with something else. Again, you can inspect it to kind of see what it does. It adds a span inside of the paragraph. Of course, if we don't want to lose what's there, we could save that in a variable. In which case, p nth child 1, we're going to select that paragraph and save the text into a variable. And then I'll put that data. So in other words, we're not losing what's currently there. We're reading the text and then adding that to right? So what I've demonstrated is a read operation and a write operation. Okay. So again, we're going to have some time to kind of dive into a lot of these. One that's pretty nice is toggle class. A toggle class does both an add class and a remove class. And so let's just mess with toggle class. Let's write a little style, embedded style, and we're adding a class of red. We'll say color red. So we write a little class called red. And let's target that same thing here, toggle class of red. So every time we click this paragraph, we're going to toggle the class of red on that paragraph. Red, black, red, black. Okay, because it's pretty common that you run one chunk of code on a click and another chunk of code on a separate click, and so there's toggle functions there. So that's pretty nice, having this toggle ability. Back to here. With the attribute, you can read attributes. In this case, this reads the source attribute of an image. This writes the source attribute of an image. So depending on how many things you pass into the attribute method makes it a read, like this first line, or a write. Same thing, this is a write operation, changing the CSS and add class. There are occasions where we need to loop, and so loops are done in jQuery with the each function. Okay, sometimes loops are handled for us, but if not, the most looping that we're going to need to do is with this each method. And so what happens here is an automatic loop. You can imagine that there are several anchor tags inside of the ID of image list. There might be 5 anchor tags. And what it will do is it'll run this anonymous function on each of those anchor tags. And again, here's some of the common events. Ready, click, double click, mouse enter, mouse over, mouse out, hover. Which hover, you see that there's actually 2 events. One's for a mouse over, one's for a mouse out. So like you hover an image, you mouse over the image, you mouse out the image. Okay, and they give an example here. 2 anonymous functions go inside of a hover. So you notice this first function says, hey, the mouse is over the element. And then the second function is, hey, you've moused out of the element. Okay, prevent default events. This is really very similar to JavaScript. And again, it handles the backwards compatibility with the old browsers for us, which is great. Okay, we can have a single event, like a click, call multiple functions. And you can do that with this on, and you can remove events to certain handlers with off. So on and off are some functions that we'll cover. Again, this is kind of like, again, the title of this chapter is a fast start to jQuery. So odds are we won't be using some of these functions until a little bit later. But again, a single event like a mouse click can call multiple functions. And you can have one event trigger another event. So for example, if the user clicks a mouse, you could say, okay, that mouse click can also simulate a button click. And so events can trigger other events. Okay, and they actually show, like using the on method, you could say on click, you run this function, is the equivalent of the click event. This says, okay, when you click the image or you mouse over the image, run this anonymous function. Okay. So again, my recommendation is to practice this. What's really nice about writing the book code, specifically in this chapter, is if you wrote the book code for prior chapters, hopefully you can see that Jquery is, you can see some of the benefits. You can see that it's easier to code, okay, than the JavaScript equivalent. Okay, so that is the end of the lecture. Let me go ahead and stop the recording.